Salutations, you're listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CDH. I am Reed, aka Sick Robot, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going, everyone?
And in this episode, we are going to be covering practice games. How you go about putting them together, what you get out of them, how to make the best out of practice games, etc. And this is for, either getting practice in with a new deck, or specifically preparing for a tournament or an event of some sort, or just trying to get somebody else going with their brewing process or something like that. All of the above, we'll try to talk about some general standards and good ideas and best practices behind doing all of that stuff. But aside from that, before we get into the main topic, Morgan, anything interesting recently?
Not especially. I've mostly just been pretty busy with work and haven't had too much time to get into crazy stuff, but
yep. That sounds like a common through line for the entire podcast right now.
Yeah.
It's busy season, or at least a busy month. We are going to be it's not something that we've done yet, but we are going to be doing our first 2v2 back in a while, which is gonna be fun.
For sure.
Coming back to the city of Toronto, 2v2. Great format. If you haven't heard about the format, we've actually done a podcast on it. The 2v2, I forget what number it was, but you can probably go through our backlog and find it.
It was from February 2022. I know that much.
Yeah, sure. Anyway, great format if you want to try it out. If you're looking for something new for a local LGS or local play group to try out, would highly recommend. It's a ton of fun, absolute blast. Effectively, you just play it's almost like Two-Headed Giant CDH, except you're playing not Two-Headed Giant. It's more like a 4-player game, but you play like diagonally across from each other and take individual turns.
And
good
avoid,
time.
Yeah, some of the most silly and broken aspects of Two-Headed Giant.
Two-Headed Giant. It's almost just like playing CDH, except you actually get to play hand attack spells and like strip mine. That's basically it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. If you ever wanted to play Canadian Highlander but with a commander.
Yeah, just how many different ways can you sell 2v2 to the general CDH audience? It's not unreasonable that we may run like another event. We have run an online 2v2 tournament at one point, but might do it again, might not. But let us know if anybody's interested as well, because I think we'd be happy to run like a 1-day event or something for it.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's all just to of course antagonize Keegan and Zach if they're listening, because they know.
And also that, actually, I don't know how many of those people still listen, but I remember when we used to go to those events regularly, we'd get a few people always complaining about how the section of us talking about what happened at the most recent 2v2 took like 5 minutes at the start of the episode.
True, actually.
Shout out to those people. I remember Redshift. I don't remember who else complained, but there's some real OGs in that crowd.
Getting back to the same bit like 2 years later. It's great. 3 years later? I don't want to think about it.
3 years. More than 3 years, yeah.
Anyway, hopping into housekeeping real quick. We have 2 new patrons that we'd like to thank. First of all, thank you to Benjamin H.
And thank you to Shane V.
Y'all rock. Thanks for supporting the podcast. Much appreciated. We'll talk more about Patreon at the end of the episode, but it's probably in the description if you want to go help us out, if you want to go support the pod. In terms of new developments, we have I guess a couple of things actually. We didn't note all of them down, but we'll talk through a few of them. By the time this comes out, it may or may not be the same weekend as the r/CDH's colorful duality or duality.
I think it's like duality.
It's some pun that like works in text but doesn't really work anywhere else. Some sort of just pun that doesn't actually work. But anyway, so that's going to be the r/CDH's Discord being run on the 22nd of July 2023. So go reg if we get this out before then. Otherwise, it it might still be running, so go check it out, or you can go check out the VODs or whatever. It's a part of the r/ADH's Brewers series, so distinct from the Path of Dominance series. This one I think is you're only allowed to play the 2-color commanders and lower in terms of color identity, which is a fun one.
It's definitely
I'm a fan of the
it's definitely interesting. I think it there's a bunch of interesting stuff that is just kind of overshadowed by having a lot of really good cards in a deck together.
Yeah. It is going to be interesting having because I feel like a lot of it is like there's going to be the decks that aren't on Grafdigger's Cage, which is effectively just Winota and Kinnan, and then all of the other decks which are going to be on Grafdigger's Cage, and seeing how those work. Because I would imagine Winota and Kinnan are going to be like mostly the top 2 picks for the format. But it's interesting to have like those to build around, but you don't really have to worry about just like dying hyper consistently on like turn 2, turn 3 to like fast stuff in 4 and 5 colors.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be some
or getting out value.
Some
there's gonna be
stuff.
There will 100% be like people playing Rakdos things. But you know, it's interesting that like there's going to be trade-offs, like actual trade-offs instead of just all good stuff.
Yuriko's also an interesting
great one.
An interesting pick. I think it's of the best 2-color decks, I think it's the one that like doesn't like I think Winota in particular loses a lot when it's not like it's built to prey on a very specific type of gameplay pattern that you see in a lot of 4-color decks, and I think it struggles a little bit when people are doing a wider array of stuff that you have to stop.
And also when it's very obviously like the Apex Predator, right?
Yeah.
Like, Winota gets a lot of mileage out of, like, not being the best deck in the format. And then as soon as you limit everything to 2-color, it is now, like, pretty obviously the best deck in the format, which makes, like, the counterplay a lot more obvious.
Yeah, you'll have a much harder time convincing people to save their removal or save their counter spells. You know, don't counter Winota because Rogsai's going to go off. Yeah, well, you know, when we've got, like, a bunch of janky 2-color decks, probably have a couple turns.
Or maybe just the other half of the field does just bring Rog to Vesh and it plays the exact same way.
Possibly.
Yeah, anyway. Go check that out. Aside from that, there are some other tournaments that we should probably be talking about that we're going to, but I'm forgetting a couple of them. So there's one again in Kingston, Ontario on the sometime. Do you have the date?
It's late August. Oh no.
Late August. I'm not even sure that we have ads for it anyway, but yeah. If anybody's in the area of just Ontario in general, specifically Kingston, we will probably be making the trek out there to go play in that. So we'll drop information for that at least in the Discord when we have it. Potentially go back and put it in the
August
description
26th.
for the episode. August 26th. There you go. And then there are like 2 others that we might be doing soonish, and I cannot remember either of them. So, Morgan, do you got them? No.
Sorry, I don't know what you're referring to.
Is there a Bufftown Bullies one happening?
Yeah, I thought we. I don't think I can make it, so I don't know what's going on with you guys.
Okay, yeah, that might be it. Anyway, there's something happening down there. Well, we should probably just like reshoot this entire segment, but that's fine. Well, you know what? I'm just gonna skip talking about any of these things, and you can go look in the description for the episode for all the links for the things that we are probably gonna advertise. But aside from that, yeah, you know, we're definitely prepared for all this at a time. This is what it looks like when we don't spend time doing our new developments in the show notes and instead just try to wing it. Peek behind the scenes. Yeah, anyway, so we're gonna get into the main topic now, which is gonna be a fun one, which is practice games. How do you get them? What to do with them? How to get the most out of them? Why you might want to set up consistent practice games or whatever. All that kind of stuff. Because I think we're getting to the point in the podcast now where when we talk about stuff like this, or at least like things in relation to like, you know, brewing or playing in tournaments or getting better at the game, getting better at the format. There's a lot of crossover with previous episodes, so we probably talked about like some of these concepts before. But this is sort of just like a centralized sort of discussion platform for this stuff to, talk about like a bunch of the stuff that we think is important about getting in practice games. So the first things first, how do you set up practice games? Morgan, how do you set up practice games?
I just ping in my friend group server, and then we have practice games.
Yeah, there you go.
I think one of the, like, we'll talk about all the stuff that's like nice to have in your practice games, like practicing against certain decks or whatever. But I think like what will actually go a long way is if you, when you're setting up just like a game, just let the people in the game know that like, hey, I've got this tournament coming up, so I'm like trying to practice. So basically just like if people could take it seriously, do their best, like that actually does help a decent amount. Like even if people aren't really going out of their way to like play super tight and consider all the lines, just like a little sort of acknowledgement, and even if it's largely subconscious of like, okay, I'm gonna take this seriously, will I think increase the quality of your games pretty drastically. Versus,
yeah, definitely,
I mean, some playgroups are just like that naturally, but like certainly some playgroups, people do silly things, they keep sketchy hands, they whatever. So just like letting people know that you're looking for practice can often eliminate a lot of that.
Yeah, setting the tone really for just like the game that you're about to play. And yeah, like I think it's definitely a good idea to, even if you like let that be known to the rest of the table, and even if like the other people aren't playing particularly tight because they're just like, well, I was just looking for like casual games, so like you can practice, but I'm just gonna like play how I usually play. Just like getting yourself in your own mindset about like, okay, I'm playing this game to improve. So like even if other people are like making suboptimal plays or just like having fun playing loosely, whatever, I'm going to be thinking about a lot of the stuff that I need to be thinking about in terms of like the deck slots that I've been looking at, the like play patterns that I've sort of been trying to figure out with this deck, like what does it do well into, what does it not do super well into, and just sort of like making those observations and making sure that you're locking in that you're making those observations rather than just sort of just playing some games on autopilot.
Yeah, it's definitely your opponents having the right mindset is important, but a lot of it is just how you're approaching the game as well.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so in terms of actually putting together maybe like a practice group or just like a sequence of practice games or whatever, the big things are, I mean, sort of obviously, if you just like listen to this, as the big two things are going to be the decks that people are playing and then the people that are playing those decks. Wow, shocker, right? That's crazy that would be the primary two things that you have to care about when putting together practice games. But it's always a good one just state the obvious and then work into it a bit. But in general, so like say if you're doing practice games with no real goal aside from just like evaluating a deck that you're playing or like a new brew or something that you're picking up, it's a good idea to try to get a diverse range of decks. You don't want to be playing like a 3-way Goto mirror plus whatever brew you're playing. Probably not a good idea. Probably not going to get you great testing results or like just in general good feedback. So just trying to get like a diverse set of decks. I think a lot of people focus a bit too much on trying to get like perfect pod compositions, and there is like time and space for like getting specific pod compositions and running those for like 20x 30x games and just seeing how it turns out. But a lot of the time you can get a lot of results and a lot of good just good takeaways from just playing against a diverse range of decks and playing against like maybe just like two people in the pod swap decks every game, and you just get like a variety of different pod compositions with different people sitting in different seats. You're gonna get a lot of that, a lot out of that, even if it's not like you're not like testing in the specific meta that you want to be testing for. And then in terms of pilots, definitely this one's sort of tougher in general. I mean, it's I think we've had I feel like I've had this conversation with somebody. I feel like you were there, Morgan, about like how do you assemble good practice groups, and the sort of the concept is really just being like just making like active connections with people that you think would be like good practice to play against, that you think are like playing tight or also have like a similar improvement mindset, and then just trying to like assemble a group of at least like 4 people to like make a pod or whatever, or potentially more, and then just like jam games with that group consistently, and like just try to make sure that like everybody's trying to get better, or like everybody's on like a good level and playing that way. Which can be like, it might sound like a lot of work, but you can probably get like at least like a consistent pod that you could play like weekly with like the same people together. And if you all have an improvement mindset, it's like relatively easy to actually put that together, and the quality of games over just playing in like just posting like random LFGs and like large-ish gameplay servers is like it's exponentially better for improvement and for like getting like good takeaways for testing games and practice games.
And honestly, even if the like another thing that is sort of important on that front is, even if like, you know, in a holistic sense, the games aren't like better, like the people you're playing with aren't, you know, particularly skilled or whatever, just having some level of consistency and continuity means that whatever information you get from your games is just gonna be a lot more useful, right? If you like make a change, yep, and then you see, oh, you know, I've started doing this, you know, taking this action more, or playing this way, or trying to do this or that, and then like you compare your success, you know, you can maybe draw at least some tentative conclusions, or like you can, you know, you can analyze your results. Whereas if it's like, okay, well, against these opponents on these decks, you know, I wasn't doing X, and then I played a completely different set of opponents on a completely different set of decks, and I started doing X, you know, like, are those results meaningful?
Yeah,
do they,
are they
like,
based on the decks, or are they based on like the people that you're playing against? And it just so happened that like one pod was way more likely to feed a heuristic study than the other pod or whatever, right?
Yeah. So just having something consistent, and also like essentially it's probably easier to find a play group and then try and turn them into a practice group than like completely organically build a practice group from, you know, from scratch. Like if you just, you know, to add on what Reed was saying, like just find people who you think would be good to play with, and then play with them, and then when you're looking for practice games, all of a sudden you'll have connections with people who you think would make good practice partners.
Yeah. Like really, from my end, the stress here is that like you want to play with people who want to improve, and it shouldn't really matter the objective skill level of anybody involved. Obviously, like if you're like looking to get like really good and you're like looking to improve really quickly, and it would obviously be like really beneficial to play with like 3 like really good players who are going to like pick apart your game, and like whenever you make it obvious whenever you make a mistake, not like in a toxic way, but just being like, oh, that was probably like suboptimal, you probably should have done this sequencing instead, or like, oh, maybe like this like game plan might have been better. Like obviously playing with 3 people who can like point out every single one of those things that you're doing wrong every game is going to be a lot better than like if you can't. But it's just more about the mindset in general of people wanting to play productive games and wanting to get better and wanting to notice these things, rather than people who like just want to play games with fun. And obviously fine to want to play CDH for fun, but that's not what
Ew,
practice
fun?
games are for, right?
Gross. I hate fun.
So yeah, I would say that's like a majority of the getting a group together in the first place. And then even for, for like getting individual games once you already have like a group together, it's sort of going to be like a similar thing of just like setting ground rules ahead of time and sort of figuring out like if you want to play against specific decks or if you like have a like specific requests from people, and just like talking it out ahead of time is also a huge one, even like once you get a group together just for every game. Obviously if you just have like a running through line of like this is what we're playing games for, so we don't have to talk about it every game, that's fine. But I would say just make sure that you get a ground rules / expectations / goals set at some point before playing games, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then before games as well, one of the things that I put down here was figuring out once you have a group together and like you've laid down ground rules and you know that you're like when you're pointing out mistakes, you're not being toxic, you're just like trying to improve, you're trying to bring stuff to people's attention and stuff like that. Before games, figuring out if you actually are testing for like a specific meta or like a specific pod composition or like specific versus specific strategies in general, just checking that out with the rest of the people that you're going to play against and being like, hey, does anybody like have one of X decks together, or like, hey, is it possible to get a pod that looks like X just so I can test this deck? Because I think you'd be surprised at maybe not the ease, but like the frequency at which you would be able to put together specific pod compositions if that's like actually what you needed to play against. Obviously, if you have like only like a 4-person testing team and that's all you're doing and everybody plays like exactly their main deck, it might be a bit of an issue.
Wait,
but
Lyndon's not here. We can also say, hey, just play on Trice, so then you can switch decks more easily and get the pods you want.
Yeah, that. Do play on Trice. If you're doing testing games, honestly, playing paper testing games just sort of sucks. Trice is by far the superior platform for testing games, but if you can't, just try to have like 2 or 3 decks together for this kind of thing. Especially if you're not doing active testing, but somebody in your play group is. Having a couple of decks or like 3 decks together with like varying strategies and like all being like relatively strong. Like maybe you have like 1 or 2 brews, sure, but like having like traditional like good meta deck together, or a couple in a variety of strategies is going to be like really useful for this kind of thing where it's like I need to test against a really fast pod. I need to test against a bunch of like mid-rangey blue decks. I need to test against a bit of stacks, but also like a mixed pot. Like I want to see what it looks like when I'm playing against like 2 stacks decks and a fast deck or whatever. It's really, really nice to have those options when you're doing practice games as well.
Oh,
one of the things
we forgot to mention for finding your games is if you don't have a play group, or like it's not particularly feasible, especially for online tournaments. Often, whatever server's hosting the tournament will have some way to connect with other players who are looking for practice, and then that shortcuts a lot. Like if you find other players who are looking for tournament practice, then you know that they're intending to take it seriously and they're probably going to be playing their best deck and all of that. So if you're practicing for an online tournament, just check out the server, maybe ask around. You can probably find some practice partners there.
Yeah, great recommendation as well. And then I was just gonna say, like, you can even take the pod composition thing even deeper, and this one is sort of I guess maybe not deeper, but it's like sort of adjacent to it, of potentially also looking at playing against like specific scenarios or game states, and then like engineering opening hands to achieve that. I'm not sure that we do this a bunch, but in general, like if you're like concerned about like how a deck is going to play versus specific permanents or specific things being in people's hands over the course of a game, there's nothing in the rules of CDH in general, I guess, saying that you can't just like put together a pod of 4 people and being like, okay, person in first, can you just start with like an Esper Sentinel in your hand plus like 6 cards for your mulligans, and then you just like will consistently have the turn 1 Esper Sentinel so I can like play against that and like see what it's like and see what the deck feels like under that scenario. Or like this, whoever in the pod has like a Grafdigger's Cage, we'll just like put a Grafdigger's Cage in your opening hand and like I'll see how my deck functions versus that or whatever, like that kind of thing, right? I think it's like
you certainly can do that.
I'm not saying that you should. I'm just I wanted to put this as a note here just because I think messing with the actual like game itself is not something that crosses people's mind, especially when like testing for a tournament or an event or like testing like a serious deck. Obviously it's not always going to be super useful and you have to like have some caveats on your results when you do that, but I do think that's like something just to be aware of. Like, you can do this. Like, it's there's nothing in the CDH community rulebook saying that like you can't engineer specific scenarios to play against. Yeah, exactly. Like,
yeah, but yeah, I guess like if you have something that you think might be useful, or like you want to test something specific, you know, you can always ask the people you're playing with how they feel about it. And you know what, they might say, you know, no, I'd rather just play a normal game. But you know, there's I think with a lot of this stuff, there's really no harm in asking.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, a lot of practice games in general are like just communication, and especially like around the discussion, you just want to make sure that like nobody is taking it the wrong way, or that like everybody's being like respectful about, because you know you get into a lot of discussions about like, oh, you made a suboptimal play, or like, oh, I'm not sure that card's good here, or like X or whatever. But like, you know, you want to all get on the same page that you're here for improvement, or you're here to like do analysis of a bunch of different stuff. So yeah, communication turns out really big thing. And also I feel like CDH nerds have to hear that a bunch, because turns out the average the average person that plays CDH probably not super socially aware just in general.
True.
So
yeah, actually communication is just super important, something to work on. Also good for practice games.
Yep. All right, cool. I think that's like most of what we had for the primary stuff for like getting games set up and sort of like pre-game stuff and that. And we can move on to our second subtopic here, which is what to track and why. Morgan, I had a couple of things written down, but I know you wrote this down, so you probably have stuff on your mind that you wanted to talk about here.
Well, so I sort of wanted this to be open-ended, because I think I originally wrote it. Did I write what to track and why? I think I wrote it slightly differently, because like I think a lot of people track. I think it's possible for tracking to actually be not super helpful, or to create impressions that aren't necessarily super useful. One word I've sort of been trying to avoid using throughout this discussion is data, because the reality is, if we're talking about like, hey, I have a tournament coming up in, you know, some relatively short time frame, 6 weeks, what you're gathering isn't data in a meaningful sense, where you can, you know, perform statistical analysis to draw conclusions, unless you are like a fiend and you're dedicating
you just play like 8 hours of CDH a day, and like
so like I think often people will track things and they'll look at like their 10 game moving average of win rate or something like that, and sort of draw conclusions from that I think are, you know, sometimes detrimental, because they just create strong impressions where really there's either pure chance or like you know, a primarily chance with a small amount of signal, but mostly noise. And so I think that you know, tracking can be somewhat detrimental in that way. That being said, obviously, having even just like a few notes or some observations written down can be extremely useful, even just so that you don't forget what happened. You know, if you want to go back and think about, you know, ways you want to try and improve or ideas you might have, just having things written down means you don't have to rely on what is, I'm going to just assume your imperfect memory, like probably
Yeah.
don't have a photographic memory.
I mean, if any of our listeners have photographic memory, let us know, because that is really cool, but I'm assuming you don't if you're listening to this.
Yeah, so like just having it, you know, be having notes or having some information recorded does streamline that process, but I would caution, yeah, I guess I would say notes are fine, or even like a record is fine, but if you start treating your sample size of, you know, a few dozen games at most as data from which you draw what you're calling, you know, statistical conclusions, I think you're probably going to that's gonna lead you astray.
Yeah,
a lot more than
you're actually going to draw meaningful conclusions from it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is basically just an extension of the overall CDH thing, which is that like you don't have enough data. You think you have enough data, you don't have enough data. Don't take don't put stock into it. But yeah, just realistically, be careful about what you're tracking, and it should more be to either in very limited senses or just for your own reference and not really to draw direct conclusions from. That being said, there are a couple of things that I'd written down for specifically like things that if you want to track, if you do need to track stuff or want to track things, I think there are a couple of things that are worth tracking, depending on like what you're looking to get out of practice games. Big one for me is, this isn't data, but it's just sort of making a mental note, or again, like Morgan said, writing it down, just having a notebook of keeping track of potential card choices or effects that are not currently in your deck, but that you wish you had access to. A lot of the time, this is great for like the initial stages of a brew, or if you're testing like an unfamiliar meta game. Just playing in a game, if you fire off a tutor, being like, I really wish I had this thing to go get right now, and it's not in the deck. So like maybe I should like write that one down and consider like putting it in the sideboard or the maybe board, and think about if I need to slot it in to the deck for this specific situation. And then like as an extension of that, like determining if you actually need to find space for that effect, or if you can like work around it with the rest of the deck, or if there are like some other play patterns that you could have taken that meant that you like didn't necessarily need to have an additional card for it. You could have just worked through it with your existing deck. So, you know, just stuff like, hey, I fired off this Whirly Tutor. I really wish that there was a Skyclave apparition in the deck, or just like some way to like some creature that could blow up artifacts and enchantments or like permanents in the deck. That kind of stuff. Or like, you know, maybe I should have a mass removal piece in this deck that isn't a Cycrypt. Like maybe I need to be able to remove a bunch of creatures, so I'll slot in like a Toxic Deluge or a Fire Covenant or something like that. And then testing with those. And then second for me at least is definitely A/B testing. This one is a bit more data-like. It's sort of creeping more into that area, but it's really just sort of this is something that I would recommend like writing down and then like keeping context for, so that you can come back and like not just look at numbers, and you can sort of like remember the situations for things. So like A/B testing would be like, you have a card in your deck that you're considering a relatively even swap for, so like a very similar effect that just has like similar upsides or downsides, and then just keeping track of in a game, when you have it in your hand or when you have access to it, which one would have been better in that situation. So say you have a deck where you're considering a Soul Partition or a Snap in the main board, and like you're playing Soul Partition right now. I'm just keeping track of like, oh, I'm firing off a tutor. Well, if I found Soul Partition here, it wouldn't do anything. Would Snap have done anything if I had found Snap instead? oh, I'm casting a Soul Partition here and it didn't feel that great. With Snap, it felt better here. That kind of thing. Same thing, like offer you can't refuse and dispel, that kind of thing. Just keeping track of A/B testing. I'm still a huge proponent of A/B testing, even though I don't actually practice it, but I think it's still very useful for so the refinement stage of brewing, as well as testing for like getting your exact 99 nailed down for a tournament list. Like when you're in the last 5 slots or so, being like, okay, like many a time me and Morgan have been playing testing games with like, okay, Fimage was good here, or like we're playing a Priest of Titania in this slot. If it was a Phantasmal Image, would it have been like particularly better here, or would I prefer to have the Priest?
Yeah, and I think again that's like a much more realistic approach than, say, trying to play a number of games with card A and play a number of games with card B. Like, you're just, even if you're tutoring for it relatively aggressively, or like, it's a common tutor target, you're still going to be looking at like generously a 50% rate where you see it, and then if the statistical difference in effectiveness is like 10% between the two cards, to get any sort of meaningful number, you're looking at like 30 plus games with each card, and like that's just not realistic. Whereas you can definitely get more of a sense in a smaller number of games if you just consider, first of all, you consider every time. So it's not just, did I win or lose this game? It's which one would have been better. Like, you can consider it every time you cast a tutor, right? Like, if I had X in my deck, would I be getting it now? Would it be good? So you get more data points per game, plus you don't have games where you get no data, plus your data is, well, it's less objective in that it's not, did I win or did I lose? It's, it's a much stronger signal, because whether or not you win or lose is an indicator of whether a card was good or bad in a given situation, but it's not a one-to-one correlation.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other one would just be like the inverse of like things that you wish you had access to, which is like just keeping track of like cards that you're just like never tutoring over a diverse set of games, or like things that you just like never found a use for. Always a nice thing to just like keep track of in the back of your head, or keep track of
or that are getting stuck like, in your hand.
Yeah, just like things that you realize that you're never casting. It's like, oh, I have this Myrel in the deck, and I'm just like never casting this Myrel, or I'm just like never tutoring this Myrel over like the Grand Abolisher that I also have. So like maybe that should make its way out, or like like this Mnemonic Betrayal is like really bad in this specific meta. Like I'm just like never tutoring for it. Maybe I should have it out for here. Even though it's like great in these other metas that I've been playing in. So it's just like that kind of stuff. You have any other ones? I feel like these are like sort of the main ones that I keep track of, but
I mean, definitely like just broadly any like mid-range engine that isn't one of the very best ones is one I'm always like, okay, I'm going to be paying attention to, is this getting stuck in my hand all the time? Or like synergy pieces with your commander, that sort of thing. Like the things that are strong and on the expensive side, but not necessarily like instantly game winning, are ones that I'm generally gonna focus on a little bit more, because like there is a very clear threshold of, or not a clear threshold, but like there obviously is a threshold of, hey, too much clunk in this deck is gonna get in the way, so you want to be you want to be playing those powerful synergy pieces, and like you do need, at least in most decks, something that generates you value over time and can allow you to play a longer game. But it's definitely easy to overload a deck with that and start trimming your interaction or your win cons or whatever, and wind up hurting more than you're helping.
Definitely.
The combination of diminishing returns and opportunity cost is, creates, there's always a threshold. You can always add too much good stuff is bad stuff.
I don't know what you're talking about. I feel like, never mind. I was about to make a joke that I feel like I've I feel like it's because I pulled it from my unconscious. We've already had this exact discussion on the podcast, which is the deck full of ancestral recalls and Black Lotuses. Anyway, yeah. So sort of like dovetailing into that topic, something that I had here, in terms of sort of like making the best out of like the limited data that you have, or like the limited time that you have for practice games, because you're never gonna get like perfect practice. You never like, it's very rare that you're gonna get 10 games with like all of these different pod compositions that you want to test into. It's very rare that you're gonna get the perfect pod compositions. You might have to do like some substituting. It's gonna be like, oh well, I'm not not playing against this 4-color deck. I'm playing against like Urza in that slot instead, so I have to make like what equivalencies I can. Sorry, Keegan. It's valuable testing, just the deck is not very popular in tournament metas. But yeah, like, so just the idea of like trying to draw more out of those experiences than like at face value. And this is sort of like, yeah, again, this is sort of like interlocked to the previous point as well, but it's less about like interpreting the data involved and more just like trying to like think about if you think any of the experiences in the game that you played are analogous to something that you might see in like other games, more serious games, tournament games, etc. Just as a way of like, again, getting more out of like any random game that you might be playing. So the idea for this one would be stuff like, if you played in a game where somebody had like a resource denial stacks piece, say something like, Rule of Law denying your actions, like a static orb denying your mana, Trinisphere, like, again, locking you out of doing a lot of stuff except for doing like a lot of stuff in one turn. If you like lost to like one of those stacks pieces, or like you didn't lose to it, but you played a game under one of those for like the vast majority of the game, just consider if the situation would have been like meaningfully different for you if you had been playing under like a Rule of Law instead or whatever. And thinking about like, okay, like are any of my experiences in this game, in this situation, analogous to what would have happened if I would have been playing in a different pod, but somebody would have like resolved a similar effect. This is obviously like a weird one, but I found that it can be useful for, again, like if you're just playing against like some friends, like decks that like aren't the best decks in the meta, or you're just playing in like random pods on like LFG servers with people playing like whatever decks they want to bring, trying to, again, draw the most out of those. It's something that you like might want to think about, just because there are like situations that are like weirdly analogous to other ones. Again, like the resource denial stack sort of thing is that like the idea is that like, Trinisphere sometimes can sort of act like a Rule of Law, or like a Rule of Law and a static orb sometimes are like sort of analogous in a lot of ways, depending on like how your deck plays. So just considering if you can make those connections. Thoughts, Morgan? You would just never do this. You would never recommend that anybody try this.
No, I mean, obviously, like, trying to, I guess we could summarize a lot of this as just think about your games.
Yeah, fair.
Like, I do think
probably the better takeaway, but
I do think that, I mean, obviously thinking about your games is good, and talking about them is good. It can be tricky. Like, a lot of those things are not super analogous. Like,
yeah.
Like, okay, if there's a Rule of Law versus if there's a static orb, I'm restricted to casting one spell a turn. So like maybe that's useful information for me. But it makes a huge difference to, I don't know, the Yisan player across the table, which one of those stacks pieces is in play, right? So it can definitely like, you have to be very careful with stuff like that, because while certain things might have a similar effect on you, or on your deck, or on your, game plan, you do have to account for the fact that they can have hugely different effects on different decks and different game plans.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
So
so
I definitely should have said that like one of the one of the things that I should have gotten out of the way before this is like this isn't about like evaluating how a game would have gone or like how games might go with this. It's more about like how does your deck operate under these conditions.
sure, yeah, and
Yeah.
that again, you can get some useful data there, though. You know, if the Winota deck puts down a rule of law and then is like slamming down more stacks pieces and attacking every turn, versus if the, I don't know, if some other like green white stacks deck puts down a rule of law, you know,
Right.
it can be hard to separate how your deck functions from how, what, you know, I mean, one of the ways
like
your
how
deck
it can
functions is how
contest
does it
other
handle
gameplay.
what your
Yeah.
opponents are
Yes.
throwing against it.
Fair.
And
fair.
that stuff can change a lot depending on the context that stacks pieces are being played in. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't, you know, I'd be weary of drawing particularly firm conclusions
Yes.
from those methods.
I will just say that it's I found it productive sometimes just for getting like vague, like okay, that's what like my general stacks matchup is like, or like, you know, what's my general like counter matchup like, or like my general like, you know, like stack interaction matchup like, if I'm playing like a wide variety of card types and such and people are holding up mana and speed.
Yeah, I think
they could sort of be interesting for
particularly when you're trying to extrapolate. I think you can extrapolate questions.
Yes.
Much more
yeah, sort of.
And like
yeah.
that's still useful, you know, saying like, oh, I now know how, you know, I played several games against Winota, so I know how my deck handles rule of law. Or like how my deck handles stacks would be a huge overstatement. Even how my deck handles rule of laws would be an overstatement because, you know, the context of the rule of laws went against Winota is different than against other decks, etc. But, you know, asking yourself questions like, you know, do I need to be removing rule of laws quickly? Do I need, you know, a plan for this stacks piece or that stacks piece? You know, is there some tool I need? Is there some way I should be playing, some strategy I should be going for when I see those coming down, or a commander who's likely to have them? And then asking those questions, even if you don't necessarily answer them, you know, when you get into a game in a tournament, say, having that series of questions to ask yourself when something develops in front of you, you know, you can still, even if you don't have like a list of all the perfect answers, asking the right questions and then thinking about it and extrapolating from what experience you do have is, you know, that's basically just how you should be translating your practice into your tournament games.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. So next up here we have probably should have reordered some of these, put this at the start, but that's fine. It's just some quick points about mindset going into games. We touched on this a bit just with you know, just so far talking about like actually like thinking about the games and like alternative things that could have happened, like prediction confirmation, that kind of stuff. But in general, and for mindsets, huge one for practice games, I would say probably the most important for like staying in the correct mental zone for playing practice games is not like overvaluing winning or losing at all, and potentially like not really valuing the actual outcome of the game at all, and really putting like all the focus on just your play inside of the game. Huge one.
Yeah, for sure. I think like when I'm prepping for a tournament, I'd much rather play a game, you know, that I think I played really well and lose than, you know, make a bunch of mistakes and still win.
Yeah.
Because I think particularly when you're trying to improve, I mean, obviously winning more is a sign that you're improving, but over, you know, a dozen games, it's the variance is so high that it's not much of a sign. Like if you play a dozen games, you play 10 games and you win 2 of them and you go, wow, that's only a 20% win rate. And then you play 10 more, you make some change. You play 10 more games, you win 3 of them. You went from 5% below expected to 5% above expected. Or another way of looking at it is that you won 1 more game in the second setup. Like, like that could happen 1,000 different ways.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think, yeah, on the subject of, you know, mistakes and playing well, identify mistakes, identify your mistakes, ask people if you think, you know, you made mistakes. If you have a play group that is amenable, talk about things you think that they, like, mistakes they might have made. This one's always easier when you didn't win. You know, it can come across like
yep.
like you're being a bit of a dick if it's like, so I won and here's why, it's because you're bad. Whereas it's like, you know, when people make things that you think are mistakes, you know, and then you don't win, it's very easy to be like, hey, I'm not saying I'm better than you, I just, you know, I wonder about this or that. And you know, you might be wrong. Maybe, you know, the card's in their hand, they go, oh well, yeah, I see that, but you know, I had this card, so I was trying to set up for an opportunity to do whatever. Or, you know, I didn't think I needed to answer that threat because I thought, you know, the game was going to end before the Rhystic Study drew too many cards, and whatever it is. You know, just getting a bunch of information, getting a better sense for the way other people are seeing the game. For, you know, it can often be useful for sort of evaluating your own reads on the game. Like, a big one for me is after games, trying to ascertain, because like often I'll look at a board state and go like, I could go for a win here, but I can't protect it, and you know, I'm just not going to try because there's a bunch of people with cards in hand and untapped mana, and we haven't seen a lot of interaction. And just asking after the game, confirming that it was there, or if it wasn't, trying to sort of update my mental models on what signs I'm reading and when I'm interpreting or you know, trying to predict what sort of interaction is out there. Just asking people at the end of the game, hey, was I right on this read? Definitely helps improve those over time.
Yeah. And also just I mean, even generalizing that, like a bunch of that stuff even more, just asking questions in general in games. It could be either like in the moment or afterwards, and just being like, hey, like, what would you have thought of this line? Or like, oh, like, what do you think I should have done here instead, if you're playing against like somebody who has like a similar experience in like a similar style of deck to the one that you're playing. Just like asking questions to the rest of the table and gathering viewpoints on things is a pretty good idea in general. Just to, you know, get comparisons. So again, you can just like update whatever your evaluations of a bunch of things are. Just, you know, we're getting into like just general improvement goals or like improvement strategies for like anything, but you know, I think they are worth repeating and bear understanding.
I think another sort of thing to, you know, to add to mindset is, if you are like, obviously the stuff we've been discussing isn't, I mean, obviously lines is a deck specific thing, but a lot of it's sort of broad. If you are trying to improve sort of your mechanics, for lack of a better term, you can also like have your mindset be, okay, for a few games I'm gonna focus on X. Like, you know, for a lot of people, I think the way you know, I feel like this is my my topic that I bring up all the time, but the way people play their mana and use their mana bases, it's really easy for it to just, you know, turn into autopilot, and then, you know, you don't get punished for it that often. But if you sort of decide like, okay, this game I'm gonna like really pay attention to, you know, how I'm sequencing my mana, what colors I have access to, what I'm able to hold up, what I'm not able to hold up, and like consider alternate scenarios that could have happened, you know, you can really improve your understanding there. Like I make a point of doing that. Like every once in a while I'll be like, okay, I really want to, like, usually it'll be after I make what I consider to be a mistake in how I handled my mana. I'll be like, okay, these next couple games I'm gonna like really pay attention to it and try and like reinforce the good habits and expunge the bad ones. Because yeah, like there are heuristics. It's like, oh well, you know, you always want to be fetching blue mana when you can, and then, you know, you get to some point where it's like, oh, because I've only been fetching blue mana, I now have this like really awkward scenario where I have to fetch like some second, like I have to fetch my second blue-green source, and like I don't want that for this reason or that reason, or I need to cast some heavily pipped card, and you know, I was fetching only blue mana and now I have this Necropotence, and like that's super awkward,
yeah, like,
or whatever.
This Granite Ball sure is like uncastable now.
Yeah. I wanna play Ranger Captain and find Esper Sentinel.
The classic.
So yeah, just sort of playing a game where you decide to be aware of that, or you know, where you really pay attention to, like, particularly this is more for decks that have like disruptive permanence, but like making sure you're really considering the order in which you play them.
Yeah,
because, you know, the heuristic is like, oh, be mana efficient, and you know, you want to, like, oh, you really want to get the Drannith down before people get their commanders, you want to be mana efficient, and it's like, yeah, sure, obviously those things are true, but you know, I've definitely played games where, for example, like, people held Rule of Laws because they wanted to play like 2 stacks pieces a turn for 1 or 2 turns and then play the Rule of Law.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, we died because I wanted to get down, you know, the Blind Obedience and the something else, and then, oh, look, we died because there wasn't
somebody
a Rule
had a
of Law
bad
in
spell.
play.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's just like another example of, you can play games where you really focus on one aspect of your gameplay.
Yep. I think it's definitely just something in general. Again, this is for improvement in a lot of things, but there's a really good way, a really efficient way of improving in general is, and this is just reiterating the exact same thing that Morgan just said, just more generally, is spending games focusing on a singular aspect of your gameplay and focusing on just trying to improve that, or just trying to play it as optimally as possible. Again, like a specific part of your mechanics, a specific game plan. I'm just gonna try to figure out, like, I'm gonna dedicate this entire game just to figuring out what my optimal tutor targets are for like every tutor that I cast, and that's like all I'm focusing on. I don't really care about like winning. I don't really care about like sequencing the rest of my stuff. Just trying to get like good habits. And then a corollary to that is also constantly being on the lookout for what your bad habits are. And if you're making the same mistakes constantly, focusing on weeding those out of your decision trees and weeding those out of your gameplay for as many games as it takes, or just like a few games at a time every session, just to try to get rid of them. If you notice that like you're making bad attacks continuously, okay, I'm gonna every turn now I'm just gonna focus on what my good attacks are. Oh, I'm missing Rhystic Study triggers for some reason. Okay, this game I'm like, when I have a Rhystic Study or Mystic Remora or an Esper Sentinel down, or like anything that produces triggers for my opponents doing things, I'm just gonna focus all game on making sure I keep track of those 100% of the time.
Yeah, and get yourself a Shock Collar, so when
But yeah, I mean, like that is how you improve, right? Is that like it's hard to improve at like everything at once, so it's really productive to identify specific things to focus on improving on for like limited periods of time until you're better at them, and then like going and switching off to something else.
I don't necessarily agree with the idea that it's hard to improve at everything all at once. Like I think, you know,
I think it's harder and slower a lot of the time. I mean, obviously you can, but like I think you like almost always get to a point where it's like more productive to like focus your improvement in specific areas.
Well,
and
certainly
get them all done.
There are diminishing returns. So
yeah,
like
sure.
If you're improving equally at the things you're already really good at and the things you're not good at, putting, or like if the effort is being spent equally, then you're going to improve very little on the things you're already good at, and you can improve a lot more by putting more effort into the your weak points. But I guess like I think one of the reasons I disagree is just because we've said this a lot, just like playing a lot of games is a great way to improve.
Well, yeah.
Just like all of this stuff is nice, if you can get.
But again, sorry, it's not just the playing of games that makes you good. I mean, obviously, yeah, if you play a bunch of games, you're just gonna get good. That's just like if you put hours in, you're gonna get better in general. But specifically, if you're playing games and thinking about the games that you're playing.
Sure. Yeah.
You should be thinking about all the games that you're playing. If you're not doing any like focused or like any improvement strategy specifically, just think about the games that you're playing. This is the takeaway here.
Yeah, like I guess what I'm saying is that like if you spend effort at trying to improve, even if that effort isn't laser targeted or spent the most efficiently or in the optimal environment, you just will improve. So
yeah.
All of these things are nice if they're options that are available to you, but if they're not, just jam some damn games.
Do the thing. Yeah, I think do I have anything else on mindset? Yeah, not really. Don't get down on yourself. If you lose games because you punted, I mean, my mantra for a long time when playing CDH was if I punted a game away or made like a very obvious mistake, it was well, I'm never making that mistake again because I made it once, and that one's now lodged in my brain, and we're gonna remember that one every time I'm about to make the same mistake. Obviously, it's not necessarily like 100% true, but that's sort of like the internal mantra for me, at least for a long time, is just like, yeah, I'm just like, we're okay, great, we're never making that mistake again because I'm not gonna let myself make that mistake again because I've made it once and now it's like locked in and I'm fully aware of it.
Which I feel like, funnily enough, it's not exactly being down on yourself, but kind of requires an unhealthy attitude towards mistakes in a lot of ways. But
yeah, that's fair. But like it's again, it's whatever works for you. If that doesn't work,
shot caller is
then if that doesn't work, then reward yourself for doing well. If you play a game that you think was particularly good, you're like, yeah, damn right, good shit, self. We played the shit out of that game. Let's go.
Yeah,
self-encouragement, all that good shit
for sure. And again, like we spent a lot of time talking about mistakes. It is important to accurately identify them because, like, a lot of things that people call mistakes aren't. There's a lot of variance in this format. Sometimes you play around the likely threat, not the unlikely threat, and they have like if you're looking at I'm trying to come up with like a good example. But let's say you have the option to play like Nullrod or Drannith Magistrate against a given deck that you think is angling for a win. It's probably pretty easy to figure out, okay, here are the win cons that they have access to that Nullrod is better against. Here are the ones they have access to that Drannith is better against. And this one's the better play because it just hits more of their stuff, or stuff that's easier for them to set up or harder to disrupt in other ways, or whatever it is. And then it's like, oh, well, they just, they had the, like, I don't know, you're playing against Malcolm Tana, and they have Malcolm in play, so you're going like, well, the Drannith doesn't stop, them from doing anything, so I'll play this Curse Totem to shut off the Glinthorn Buccaneer, and they go like, oh, cool, I just have the Gamble Breach set up. And it's like, well,
yeah,
unlucky, but obviously you're supposed to play around, if they already have Malcolm in play, you're probably supposed to play the Curse Totem, not the Drannith Magistrate, because that deck is like entirely built around setting up Malcolm Glinthorn and incidentally has Breach or whatever its backup win con
has, whatever stuff in it, really just identifying like what would probably be called like judgment calls versus misplays, or like if you're taking an educated risk, If you know what the you should you should know what the risk is when you make a decision, and if you didn't know what the risk is and then you lost to the risk, then like that's a mistake, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. I think that's most of what we had, / all of what we had. Yeah, I think it was good. It was good to get all that down on a wax tube to be played over the interwebs and people's ears. I don't ask me why I chose to go with that reference. It was a spur of the moment. I'm moving past it.
Also,
anyway,
weren't they cylinders?
Tube cylinders? Were they cylinders?
I don't think they were hollow.
No. Oh, did they have like a through? Oh, were they like wax cylinders like on a spindle or something? I don't know. Whatever.
What is this, the Land Before Time?
Yeah. So I hope that was like pretty useful, just in terms of like, you know, that sort of turned into like a general improvement podcast at the end of it. But I think that's a very that's a large part of practice games anyway. Of like practice. The act of playing practice games is also the act of improving, and they sort of go hand in hand. So improvement is the mindset, practice games is the action that you take to actually execute that mindset. So yeah, hope that was useful. Let us know if you have like any questions about this kind of stuff, because I mean this is all like super this sort of gets more abstract. There's a lot more than just like CDH concepts and like cards and stuff like that. So feel free to fire off questions in the Discord and such, or just like DMs, I guess. Either way.
There's one question not allowed to ask about, which is, when are we adding an LFG channel? Because it's not happening.
Yeah, please go use the bajillion other LFG channels everywhere else, or just like DM people for games, or honestly, you could just ask in our general channel. Just don't make a habit of it. Cool. So aside from that, again, we're not doing gut check because it's a 2-person podcast. But if you would like to submit gut checks, our patrons can submit gut checks? ? Yes. So if you're a patron, you can join the Discord and submit gut check questions. And if you submit a gut check question, we actually might end up doing one for a 2-person podcast, because it means that one of us don't have to come up with it, so it's like less of a bad idea. Anyway, moving past that, we will be doing a listener question this episode. And this one is, I guess, Morgan, you can read this because I've done a lot of talking in this podcast.
Sure. So we have from Emsmax: how can I construct a cube such that after one draft, a player can have a good idea of the archetypes and how they should approach drafting / building / playing? And you know, obviously this isn't CEDH related, but I feel like over the last few months we've spent enough time talking about cube that you know, that this is fair.
Form factors. Yep. Oh, for people unawares, I probably should have put this at the "what are you doing" at the beginning of the show. I have been putting together a cube recently of like a sort of like a Legacy Plus like unpowered cube to do testing. So this is sort of like, you know, it's relevant to my current experience, and I mean, forcing Morgan to play cube drafts and do like test drafts with me and stuff.
Yeah, the reason I haven't been up to anything you know, particularly exciting is because Reed's had me locked in his basement doing cube sims.
Yeah, so I preface this with like, neither of us are experts on cube, especially not building cubes. But I feel like we both played enough cube at this point that, you know, and like played enough like limited environments and such that like could probably give a decent answer to this one. I would say that like constructing a cube such that after a draft a player can have a good idea of archetypes is really just an exercise in building a good draft environment in general, I'd say. Or at least like a easy to grasp draft environment in general is part of that is building a cube with very defined archetypes. So like not having just, I mean, having a cube full of good cards without any synergy, I guess, is also a way of doing this, where people can just sort of draft whatever good cards they want. But I feel like that's sort of not the spirit of the question. I think the spirit of the question is that, like, yeah, you want to build, you want to have like sort of defined archetypes for all of your color pairings and all of your single colors, I'd say, and have cards like have majority of the cards in your cube fit cleanly into at least one of those archetypes a piece, if not multiple. And then, as well as that, having I think a big one is having signpost gold cards. Signpost gold cards are like they exist in like basically every set, like regular set in Magic anyway, like any set that's intended to be drafted, and for good reason, because they really are a really good way of getting people to understand exactly what all of the decks in the format are. Because when you see a gold card in 2 colors that like screams a specific archetype, you're gonna be like, oh cool, like the blue-black thing says zombie like 4 times on this one card. I guess the gold uncommon says zombie like 4 times. I guess the blue-black deck is a zombie deck. Great.
I feel like that's a particularly bad example because perennial cube powerhouse and non-archetype defining card the Scarab God says zombie on it like 4 times.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Fine. But fine.
Okay, yeah, I would say like having the signpost cards and having signpost cards in monocolor is important. Yep. Also, don't put in fake signpost cards. I see this in a lot of people's cubes. You'll see, I don't know, you'll see a card like I don't know, like a Goblin Bombardment. I think this, honestly, this was true of the Vintage Cube until recently.
For a long time, yeah.
Well, like, Goblin Bombardment used to be in, and then they took it out, and they recently put it back in. But they put it back in with, like, a bunch of cards that actually make it work. But it was in there for a while without those cards. Like, they're just, like, there was, like, a young Pyromancer, sure. And, you know, there's, like, the occasional token generation, but they did not have, like, the sort of consistent... You couldn't build a deck out of, like, I'm gonna make a bunch of tiny tokens and sack them for value, and there was no Mayhem Devil, and there was no, you know, this and that, and, like, now those cards are in there, but for a while they weren't, and that made it, like, you would see a card like Goblin Bombardment and go, like, oh, there's clearly an idea
like a red sack deck.
Yeah, there's a red sacrifice. It's probably going to be Rakdos, maybe Jund or whatever. But like, there's clearly an idea here, and then if there isn't, then people are just going to be confused.
Yeah. I would say like definitely try not to have like if your goal is to construct a cube such that like players can like easily pick up what the archetypes are, just like avoiding trap archetypes in general, trap cards in general. This is a really big feature of like vintage or like Moto style cubes of like they're built in very specific ways, and like some of those ways are that like there are archetypes that don't work a large percentage of the time except for like the 1 in 20 times that they do work, and then when they do the work they're like super good and like produce like great stories and stuff like that. Really great for MTGO when you're trying to drive engagement and like get people to have like one of a kind experiences with the cube. Not great when you're trying to get people to actually like be able to comprehend it relatively quickly and like have fun after like a single drafting the next time.
Wait, are you saying that the Mana Flare Heartbeat of Spring deck isn't?
There are so many times when I've been like, there's like I have like a fast bond and a time spiral. I'm like, this is probably the Mana Flare deck, right? And then like you pick both of them, and then just neither of them make the main deck ever.
It's never like, the Mana Flare deck.
This is terrible.
It's like wild to me how many of my I think there was like one time where I was like, I think I can actually just play Mana Flare and pass here, and I was right. And then like 6 times
every other time
where I was like, I'm not casting it here, or my opponent like cast it and passed, and I was like, you're gonna die. I'm gonna make sure you regret that one.
Well, it's not even you're gonna die. There's just so many times I've been playing a green deck and my opponent goes like Mana Flare pass, and I'm like, great, Pest Infestation for 7, kill it, and the rest of your shit pass. Like,
yeah,
congratulations, you gave me a massive Pest Infestation and lost your board for playing the Mana Flare.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, I'll take a turn with, I have like 5 lands, so I'll spend 7 mana on, playing good stuff and 3 mana on destroying your Mana Flare.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Cool, much appreciated. But yeah, I just signpost cards super important. Cohesive archetypes super important. Should really like most cubes should have a degree of synergy going on. It shouldn't just be good stuff cubes. So you should have intentionality for like how you want specific decks to be built. And obviously, there's variance. A huge like fun part of cube is building decks in ways that the cube originator never intended them to be built. But that's not why you're building this cube, right? You would be building this cube to make it easy for new players to pick up, which is like you know it should have some level of being on rails, and like you should be able to build the on rails decks, so all the 2-color decks and single color decks like pretty easily.
Yeah, I think that's
cool.
And I mean, obviously looking at other cubes and how they're constructed, and also I mean,
yeah,
looking at limited environments, right? Like,
yep,
the concept of signpost uncommons is something that comes from like not from cubes, but from and I mean, obviously, rarity in cubes is less of a thing.
Yeah, it's just not a thing.
But like cards that often are 2 colors and like clearly define an archetype that you're intending is something that you can see across like all of Magic's history. And I'm sure if you spent enough time analyzing limited environments, you'd come up with a bunch more lessons there.
Yeah, I think listen to a Resleevables podcast. I forget which one it was, but I think it was the first one of the new iteration where they did a podcast on Alpha Beta Unlimited about just like Patrick Sullivan like just being like like I'll like go back and like look through the alpha card file like every couple of months and just like bask in like how well put together it is. And like I don't think it's unreasonable that like if you're interested in building cubes that you should like go look at sets and like admire the set design and admire how they put together the limited format for that set. Especially like it's not hard to like go Google like what are the best limited environments of all time in Magic's history and just like go and appreciate those sets for what they are and like how they made that happen, right? And like if you can find like test drafts with people, like go play some of those formats and see what you like about them and see why they work and try to analyze why they work.
Time Spiral was almost one of the greatest limited environments of all time. It was so close.
Good old Innistrad, as long as you just take out the Invisible Stalkers.
But I think honestly, having done the throwback drafts when they were on Moto, I don't think a common has ever like ruined a draft format as thoroughly as Sprout Swarm.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's even if you look at cube discourse, people are just like, why do you have Sprout Swarm in your cube? It's either like not going to be good enough and then it's just unplayable, or it's just like the slowest, most inevitable death that you cannot prevent in the cube. It's just gonna be terrible every time.
Sure.
Cool. Yeah, good stuff. So that about wraps it up for this episode. If y'all would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at AnyToTheNorthPod, via our email at anytothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. And extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work toward improving the quality of our podcast. Got through it. If you too would like to become a patron, go to patreon.com/AnyToTheNorthPodcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music and to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo. Next episode will be of 2